It is 10 o'clock, so now I can officially say good morning. Okay, I'm carrying the ball this morning. Rabbi Kelman teaches at this hour, so he's unable to join us. There isn't really much that needs to be done this morning technically, since I put all of the source material into one file, so we should be able to do that without much trouble. Okay, we'll come back to this in a moment. Let me first of all congratulate all of you on being risk takers. Piyut isn't for the faint of tongue. It requires some more than elementary knowledge of Hebrew grammar and philology. I'm going to try to translate everything to the best of my ability. But one of the things that we should acknowledge at the outset is that not everything in Piyut avails itself of translation. In fact, if anything, the most consistent criticism that has been leveled against Piyut is the fact that all so often it is unintelligible. And believe me, I don't feel bad when I can't figure out what it means, because Abraham ibn Ezra, who in the Middle Ages, and perhaps even till this very day, almost a millennium later, surely must have been one of the most Hebraically knowledgeable people ever. His critique of Piyut was that he didn't understand it. So we can learn a Kal Vachomer from Ibn Ezra, and if he's willing to admit that there are things in Piyut that he just simply can't understand, then we should console ourselves with that. But I will try to make it as understandable as possible. So that's one dimension of Piyut, as I said, that requires some more than usual attention. Another is, as we will discover, that Piyut is also very rich in allusions to Talmudic and Midrashic literature. Of course, it may frequently make allusions to early classical rabbinic sources with which we are unfamiliar. So in that respect, we will be beholden to what have now been perhaps two generations of scholars, mostly Israelis, but not exclusively Israelis, who somehow, with the renewal of Jewish political independence in the state of Israel, sought to establish some new frontiers in knowledge of the Hebrew language and turned their attention to Piyutim. So starting with the famous Daniel Goldschmidt, who edited the Haggadah and edited Machzorim, and the students, his students, we now have commentaries on many Piyutim. So what I've tried to do, what I will try to do throughout, as long as we will continue this, is to select Piyutim that either lend themselves to reasonably facile interpretation, or in such cases as they are not easily understandable, I'll limit myself to those Piyutim that have already undergone some sort of scholarly analysis. So hopefully between our combined efforts and those of the specialists in the field, we'll be able to overcome the linguistic challenges and the cultural challenges as well. So with that, let me let you in. Of course, the source sheets were already available on the Torah in Motion website, but let me let you into my copy of it, and we can actually begin. So I decided to call today's class the Genesis of Piyut. Now, I thought that's quite Pythonic of me, quite poetical, because I'm playing on words. I'm going to talk about the origin of Piyut, but I'm going to link Piyutim to the Parasha of last Shabbat, the Parasha of Bereshit, whose English name is Genesis. So, in essence, the Genesis of Piyut is my attempt here, my meager attempt here at being Pythonic. The first challenge, of course, is to simply understand the etymology of the word Piyut. There is an opinion, and it's the opinion of a respectable scholar, that Piyut actually has its etymology in Hebrew. Marcus Jastrow, who edited what is to this very day, over 100 years later, still the definitive dictionary of Talmudic Aramaic, argues for the possibility that the word Piyut has its origin in lefat peit, which in modern Hebrew is kind of a pejorative association. It kind of means like to mumble, but it clearly has something to do with articulation. So other than Jastrow, however, who sees this link between Piyut and the Hebrew lefat peit, the general consensus of scholarship is that the word Piyut is borrowed from Greek. And what you see here are the Greek origins, the etymology of the word Piyut. We have the Greek word poietes, which means a poet, the Greek word poema, which means a poem or a work of poetry, and we have the word poiesis, which means poetry or a poetic creation. So clearly the poetess, Piyut, it sounds too good to be just, overlooked. So from Greek, apparently it was first borrowed into Jewish Palestinian Aramaic as the noun piyuta. The kamatz aleph at the end of a word in Aramaic is the equivalent of the hey hayidi'ah in Hebrew. So piyuta is the equivalent of ha-piyut, okay, meaning a poem or poetic composition. And in this form, piyuta, it appears in late Talmudic and early Midrashic literature, and this corresponds roughly to the Byzantine era, that is the Roman Byzantine rule in the land of Palestine, which was from about the 4th or 5th centuries to the 7th century. Remember, the 4th century is a century in which Constantine, the Byzantine Roman Empire, adopted Christianity to be the state religion. The 7th century is when the Arabs come out of the Arabian Peninsula under Muhammad and conquer Palestine. So in this era, right, from the 5th to the 7th centuries, right, that's basically where Piyut begins in the land of Israel, the same cultural setting in which Piyut as a literary genre flourished. From Aramaic, the word was absorbed into Hebrew as Piyut without the kametz aleph at the end, following the grammatical pattern, the mishkal of pi'ul, which is common in Hebrew for loan words. You might ask yourself, what about sidur? It's not a loan word in the sense that it comes from another language, but in the sense that they probably took the seder and converted it into a sidur. So in that respect, it follows the same mishkal, the same pattern. So again, just to summarize, from the Greek, right, it went into Aramaic, and from Aramaic into Piyut. Okay? And this etymology actually reflects the development of Piyut culturally, going again from the Greek, from the Hellenistic era, to first the Aramaic, and then eventually entirely into Hebrew. Now, what kind of poetry is represented by Piyut? It is liturgical poetry. Liturgy is prayer. Liturgical poetry are poetic compositions that were meant to be incorporated into prayers. But prayer isn't just the 3 daily prayers or the 4 prayers on Shabbat or Yamim Tovim or even the 5 prayers on Yom Kippurim. Liturgy and prayer extends even to ritual. That is why many of the poetic compositions that occur in the Haggadah are Piyutim, because the Haggadah is also a liturgical work. Again, it's not liturgical in the narrow sense of being a prayer, but it is liturgical in the somewhat broader sense of being part of a religious ritual. So again, the purposes of Piyut were to enrich the prayer experience. How? Through allusion to biblical texts, through linguistic artistry, and theological depth. Biblical allusions, we will see. You know, it's fascinating. We no longer see the same value in memorization of texts that our predecessors saw. And moderns in general did not invest as much effort or did not place as much value on memorization as the medievals did. And the medievals in turn were less inclined towards memorization than the ancients were. I think personally that we've lost something by not insisting on more memorization. I think that there is a sociological value just to being part of part of a group of people who all can recite the same texts by heart. But surely in the medieval period, and how even more so in the classical era, people knew things by heart. And one of the things that Jews committed to memory was the Tanakh. Long before the concordance was invented, Bible commentators, Parshanim, were able to associate words in Bereshit with words in Divrei Hayamim because they knew the text by heart. And surely the Paitanim, that is to say the liturgical poets of roughly this period of some 500 or 600 years, from roughly the 5th through the 11th or 12th centuries of the Common Era, made special efforts to be fluent in the Bible. And particularly, and that makes it difficult for us, those portions of the Bible that lend themselves more to poetic use, which means they had committed to memory books like Tehillim, Mishlei, Iyov, Kohelet, right? The biblical works that were already poetic in form. Therefore, an awful lot of the biblical allusions that will appear in Piyut come from biblical texts that generally aren't studied, let alone committed to memory. And of course, that's a challenge. Linguistic artistry. As I said, poetry is distinct from prose in many ways. And one of the most distinctive features of poetry is poetic language. Right? Instead of saying ever, you say air. Right? Poetic words. So part of the linguistic artistry of the Paitanim was their preference that they showed for poetic forms as opposed to prose forms. But sometimes they went beyond that. And their linguistic artistry was displayed by the fact that they would invent words. We will look at this somewhat more methodically in a future class, but Abraham ibn Ezra, whom I mentioned previously, and I identified him as surely someone who throughout the history of Hebrew was one of the most knowledgeable people in the areas of Hebrew grammar and philology, and yet he found Piyut difficult. One of his critiques of Piyut is that the Paitanim occasionally invented words. So it's not just linguistic artistry. It isn't just the use of poetic forms as opposed to prose, but another one of the things that we have to be on the lookout for when we read Piyutim are words that really originated with the Paitanim themselves. And finally, theological depth. I already said that Piyut is rich in allusions to Talmudic and Midrashic literature, but those allusions were not selected randomly. Those allusions that Paitanim made to Talmud and to Midrash were drawn because they met certain theological prerequisites. They made certain claims or certain statements about Judaism and about the Jewish people that the Paitanim wanted to emphasize. So again, we have to look both at the form and the content, and to see Piyutim as being a harmony of form and content, whereas unfortunately both the form and the content are not always there explicitly. Okay, another purpose of Piyut was to adapt the service for special occasions, and that we'll find that Piyutim were written for to be recited not so much on a daily basis as on an occasional basis. And the occasions that prompted Paitanic, that prompted Paitanim to compose Piyutim were Shabbatot, particularly special Shabbatot. Okay, a Shabbat that might be a Shabbat Mevarchim, Shabbat that might be a Shabbat of one of the Arba Parshiot, Parshat Zachor or Parshat Parah, Chagim, the Shalosh Regalim, of course, and of course penitential prayers, prayers for fast days, for the Ta'aniyot Tzibur, and of course for the Yamim HaNoraim. And finally, sometimes the purpose of Piyut was to replace standard prayers because they were written at a time in which liturgy, that is the text of the what we call the Siddur, was not yet fully fixed. As a matter of fact, one of the distinctive characteristics of Piyut, not only the earliest Piyutim of the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, but even of the later Piyutim of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, is that very often Piyutim substituted for what we today consider to be standard prayers. That is to say, the Chazan, as likely as not, was chosen not necessarily or not so much because he had an operatic voice, right, and great, musical range, but because the Chazan was a paitan. And on occasion, the congregation, right, would actually anticipate that the Chazan was going to recite something that they had never heard before. So again, that was yet another purpose of Piyutim. We've mentioned the features, that it employs biblical language, midrashic allusions. In terms of poetic structures, we'll see that they vary. They vary from era to era, and even in the same era, they occasionally vary from place to place, because just as the word Piyut itself is a derivative of something Hellenistic, the practice of Piyut was very much affected by the surrounding culture. So Piyutim that were written by Paitanim who lived in the Muslim world tended to, I won't say mimic, I say mirror Arabic notions of poetry, while Piyutim that were written by Jews in the Christian world, Ashkenazic Jews, were influenced by other cultural influences. One of the strict poetic structures of Piyutim, however, are acrostics, alphabetic acrostics, or occasionally acrostics that were designed to spell out the names of the Paitanim. Generally, that doesn't happen so much in the early Piyutim as it does in the later Piyutim. The early Piyutim tend generally to be anonymous, not just anonymous in the sense that it doesn't start off by saying this Piyut was written by so-and-so, but even the name of the Paitan generally does not appear even in acrostic form. Complex Hebrew style that often requires commentary. We've already taken note of that. Okay, we'll come back to this introduction occasionally. Right now, I just simply want to speak about one particular form or genre of piyut, because that's what we will encounter today. And that is that piyutim are divisible into a limited number of subsets or genres, and they are known by the functions that they served liturgically. So, for example, yotzerot. Right? Yotzerot looks like the plural of the word yotzer. Okay? The first bracha in Shacharit is the bracha of Yotzer Or, right? After we say Baruch Hu, is the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, Yotzer Or. Okay? So, piyutim that were written to be inserted at the very beginning of the Shacharit service were called Yotzerot because they were meant to accompany the bracha of Yotzer Or. Okay? Now, because they were inserted into the bracha of Yotzer Or, they elaborate on themes of creation, light, and because, according to the Midrash, the first things to exist in the world, even before heaven and earth, were angels, right? Therefore, somehow angels get into the piyutim as well. And they are especially prominent in the Ashkenazic tradition for festivals and for special Shabbatot. There are indeed, to this very day, Ashkenazic congregations, some of you may even be members of such congregations, that recite Yotzerot on special Shabbatot. The structure of the Yotzerot often consists of a series of stanzas that lead into or substitute for the standard text of the bracha. As I said again, it depends upon whether they were incorporated into the Siddur or not. And finally, who are some of the famous piyutim whose Yotzerot adorn our liturgy? Here we have two of the earliest paitanim, Yanai and Eliezer Kalir. We'll actually, we'll get to them in due course. Yanai apparently was one of the earliest, if not the earliest of the Paitanim, lived perhaps as early as the 4th or the 5th century. Eliezer Kalir, there is still some academic controversy regarding exactly who he was and when he lived. But the consensus seems to be that he lived in the land of Israel somewheres during the 7th century, and that indeed was a witness to the Arab-Muslim conquest of the land of Israel, which indeed is reflected in some of the piyutim that are attributed to him. So I think that this will suffice for the moment in terms of an introduction. So we will now look at some piyutim as they reflect the order and consequences of creation.
Can I ask you a question?
If you're sure that it's a kind of a question that has to be answered right now rather than at the end.
You gave the origin of Paitan as Greek. Is there any connection with Yoft Elokim Leyefet?
Only because there's a Fe and a Tav in it?
Well,
I tend to doubt it. I think that's there's a wonderful homily hiding in there, but I don't think it makes any philological sense.
Please save your questions for the end.
Okay.
Exactly. I hate these people who think that they know better than the.
Okay, so I chose two piyutim
Right?
that reflect reflect certain aspects, certain clearly designated aspects of creation, and although they're not presented here in their
Send it to
chronological
me.
order, I started with one that you might
Why not?
already be familiar with. This is at least part of the standard Ashkenazic rite for Yom Kippurim. It is a poem, an Ashkenazic poem. Its author was Mishulam of the famous Kalonymus family, a family that emigrated from Italy to Germany, somewhere perhaps even as early as the 9th century. And the members of this family were amongst the nobility of Ashkenazic Jewry in the pre-Crusade era. Mishulam ben Kalonymus in particular is well represented in our traditional liturgy. And this is a piyut that he composed to accompany the avodah, that portion of Musaf, of Yom Kippurim, that reflects or mirrors the functions of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim during the time that the Beit HaMikdash was still standing. And it's an alphabetic acrostic. You can see that I highlighted the first letter of the alternating lines. Okay, you see the Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. It goes all the way through to Tav. Okay, and as I said, I chose this because this is reasonably familiar. As I said, it's as familiar as the fact that Yom Kippurim was just a couple of weeks ago, and you may still, have a recollection of it. It's called Amitz Koach, right? Amitz, to be hardy, Koach, strength, right? Kabir, again, another adjective for strong or strength. Ravonim, yet another. So Amitz, Koach, Kabir, Ravonim, all these are expressions of might. Okay? And of course, they're all descriptive or attributive to God. Okay? Asher mi ya'asech ma'as gevurotecha. Asking rhetorically, is anyone capable of the acts, heroic deeds of God? Heroic not in the sense of saving damsels in distress, right? Heroic in the sense of just being far beyond those of mortal men. Okay. Ometz aliyot kirita. Now we get a description of creation in poetic form. Okay. Now I've highlighted some of the words here in the text to show that they correspond to the notes that follow. Okay. These notes are taken from an academic treatment of this poem, so it'll help us to understand. So aliyot in modern Hebrew are the different stages or floors in a building. So it basically describes the first act of creation as being aliyot kirita al karim, that God, as it were, designed or created the earth in a series of levels or tiers, okay, one above the other, right? There was earth, and above the earth was, right, the air or the water, and above that was the heavens with the waters above the heavens. So that these are the aliyot, the different tiers in which the world was created. Af yisadata tevel al blima. And of course, the tevel, the earth itself, the earth in the sense of the ground of the earth, right, stands on no foundation, al bli ma. Right? So again, this is the expression we saw reference earlier to theological profundities. Of course, this is an expression of the notion of creation of yesh me'ayin. Creatio ex nihilo, the creation of the world out of nothing. Biyot olam choshech v'tzal mavet ve'efa. At the time that the earth was still shrouded in darkness. And he uses three different synonyms for darkness. Choshech, which is ordinary darkness, tzal mavet, which is a deeper form of darkness, and efa, a poetic word for darkness. I know that we're accustomed when we recite the 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, right? We're accustomed to treating the word salmavet as though it were a contraction of two words, tsel meaning shadow and mavet meaning death. And indeed, you can think of it metaphorically. Death is darkness, and therefore the valley of the shadow of the death is certainly a valley which is deeply darkened. But the truth of the matter is that philologically, the word salmavet is not a contraction of two words. The word is tsalmat or tsalmavet, and it means very dark. So a gate, salmavet, is not literally, it may be metaphorically, a valley of the shadow of death, but literally it's only a dark valley. Okay, so at the time that the earth was shrouded in darkness, b'ma'atei levushecha or boker higa'ata. How did God give expression to light? He gave expression to light through what is called ma'atei levushcha, through his own garment. Now, this is a midrashic resolution to a Weltkasha. Right? A Weltkasha is a question that occurs to everybody, namely that if the sun and the moon weren't created until the fourth day, then how can it say Vayhi erev vayhi voker yom echad yom sheni yom shlishi? Okay, so the midrashic answer is that while the sun wasn't created until the fourth day, there was a source of light during the 3 previous days. And that source of light emanated from God himself. So here we have again expression to this midrashic notion that the original source of light, not the sun and the moon, but when God first says Vayhi or, that or was a reflection of God's own persona, so to speak. Okay. Ben zeidonim chatzta kekerach hanora bitzul hikvitam leval yechasun chaled. This again is a reference to the division of the upper and the lower waters, to what the Torah calls the rakia, the firmament. So we see that it's basically proceeding in the sequential order of the first chapter of Breshit, right? It goes from Shamayim and Aretz, Breshit bara Elohim et ha-shamayim ve'et ha'aretz, Vayehi or, and now to the second day to the Rakia. Gilita pnei neshi, v'heinetza tenuva, gan mikedem ta'ata l'sha'ashua ma'amirecha. And again, the earth itself revealed itself, and it revealed itself in tenuva, in yield. That is to say, what the Torah describes as the desha, the esev, the forms of vegetation, the eitz, the tree, the fruit-bearing trees, etc. And then eventually God establishes a gan, the Garden of Eden, mikedem, right? Ta'ata was planted, l'sha'ashua ma'amirecha, for the enjoyment or the pleasure of those who would defer to God. Ma'amirim, we'll see initially is Adam and Eve, but eventually it becomes the Jewish people. Godel me'orot tata birkia uzecha, the luminaries were placed in the firmament. Gam tzva mazarot imam tzivita, accompanied by the stars and the constellations. Day sachim v'da'im misha al tzarta, followed again on the 5th day by the different forms of vegetation. Dimyon bariach lecherat yoshevei ganim, again to establish a pattern of that is embodied in Gan Eden. Dvukat regavim hotzi'a romsim v'shoafim, from the earth there emerged all sorts of crawling things, right? Crawling things. Dar kaneu vitzala ruchat kruecha, and again, all things were done in preparation for the invited guests. There are no invited guests yet. They don't appear until day 6 and following, right? That would be again Adam and Eve. They are the kruecha, they're their invitees. Hechanta tevach v'mesech v'soed ayim. So in essence, prior to the creation of man, God had, as it were, set the table, right? He had prepared all of the meal, and yet there was no one seated around the table. So hikratzta golem mechomer betavnit chotamecha. And therefore God then created Adam, right? Adam is a golem, right? The Maharal Prague, not the first person to have used that word, okay? A golem is simply a physical form, okay? But then the golem was made of chomer, it was made of clay, betavnit chotamecha, and it was fashioned in a particular way. Hipachta bechelgo, and then into this block of clay, God then blew into it, tohar neshem, right, a pure spirit, mizvulecha, originating with God himself, okay, hordam, and then eventually he was put to sleep, umitzalao, and then from one of his flanks, ezer lo yi'adata, God created Eve from one of Adam's flanks. V'tzivito, and he was instructed or ordered, b'lilaot me'etz hada'at, not to eat from the tree of knowledge, ve'efer tzivoy, and he disobeyed this instruction, kefeti, as a fool, b'hasha'at zochel, because he was seduced into doing it by the crawler, that is to say, the nachash, the snake. Ve'unash, and he was punished. B'zeat af litrov chuko, that's the punishment of b'zeat apecha tochal lechem, that he would be able to meet his physical needs only through great exertion. The ivelet, that is the foolish woman, Chava, she was punished bitzirim, by having labor pains. Va'arum, the snake itself, the wily one, afar lachmo, was said to crawl on the ground and, as it were, to eat dust. Zeirui riva'o hikpeta beveten chomedet, zara'ava holida ikar v'ro'et son. Skips a little here, right? We don't see the immediate consequences of their eating of the Eitz HaDa'at. We jump from here already to the point where they're already living outside of the Gan Eden, and Eve is already conceiving and giving birth. Okay, and she gives birth to Ikar, right? That was the Kayin who was the Kayin who was the Oved Adama, and Hevel who was the Ro'et Son. Okay, Zebach, a sacrifice, Vashai, some sort of a gift, Higishulu Mulach Yachad, both of them, that is the Ikar and the Ro'et Son, both Kayin and Hevel, offered some sort of offering to God. Za'amta Varav, God, however, was displeased with the elder one, that's Kayin, Vishangata Churat Sa'ir, and yet he was positively inclined towards the offering of the younger one. I stopped at this point. As I said, the poem itself, it goes through the entire alphabet, 2 lines to each letter of the alphabet. It's a lengthy poem, and it goes through much more of early biblical history than is represented here. But then, as I said again, I wanted to use this as a display of how creation, the earliest episodes in the history of mankind, were captured here in this 11th century Piyut. Now, this is far from the earliest such attempt. Here is an even earlier attempt at the same thing. Here we have one of the earliest of the Paitanim, Yossi ben Yossi, lived in the land of Israel, earlier even than the 6th century. And this again is part of the Seder HaAvodah, something that he composed to be incorporated into the Musaf of Yom HaKippurim. And its opening line, again, is Azkir Gvurot, right? I will take note again of the heroic deeds of God. Again, heroic not in the sense of rescuing people, but heroic in the sense of things that exceed ordinary human competence. Here, as you see, it's not at all an alphabetic acrostic. Every single line starts with the letter Vav. And you'll also notice if you jump to the end of the lines, it doesn't rhyme. I know that the most conventional definition of poetry is that it rhymes. And indeed, late Piyutim of the 11th, 12th centuries, some even of the 10th century, already display this tendency to rhyme at the end of each line, but the earliest Piyutim do not rhyme. Okay, so here again is just another example of how the earliest chapters of the book of Bereshit are represented in an early Piyut. V'yotzer. Again, this doesn't start at the very beginning. Okay, this starts in the middle. Okay, V'yotzer, that's God. Hechish, to hasten. Ta'avat yitzuro, the physical desires of his creatures. V'hirgil ezro l'revat shukato, so that Adam and Eve figured out, or somehow God helped them to figure out, how to cohabit. V'yichama v'hizriya v'chibla v'yaleda. And here we get 4 synonyms for the birth process. Yichama, literally, to be in heat. Hizriya, right, to be seated. Chibala, to undergo labor pangs. Yalada, to actually give birth. Okay. Ubikra, firstborn. Misaded talmei adama. Again, this is a complex biblical form drawn from the book of Job, but it's a description of Cain again as a farmer, as an oved adama. Talmei adama are furrows. Misaded talmei adama, probably one who arranges the furrows in a field, something like that. Again, a poetic way in which to say farmer. Vosifa shenit, and then she gave birth yet a second time. V'hivricha, right? Vishilecha. Here again, she expelled. Okay. Avil, a being, okay. Tomech shevet, who carried a staff. Why? Because he was a roeh adarim, a shepherd. Okay. Uvitchurat shai, and with a gift, kidmu pnei melech, both the two of them, the farmer and the shepherd, approached God. Zeh, namely Cain, b'fri eretz, with things that grew from the ground. V'zeh, Hevel, b'fitrei tzon, with the firstborn of his flock of sheep. V'hibit kadosh lalev, v'lo le'einayim. God, however, is not persuaded by appearances. God looks into people's minds and hearts rather than to their eyes. And therefore he was able to see, as we know, V'sha erech nichoche tza'ir, that he saw that indeed the gift that was being offered to him by the younger one was the true, had the greater value. Therefore, v'sigev ach koder limarom, he raised up a koder is a potter, literally. I'm not sure exactly what it is here. I don't know, not sure. You'll notice that it also in the very next line, you have the form hikdir. Anyone know the Hebrew song, Kadru Pnei Hashamayim? Kadru, Kadru Pnei Hashamayim, no? It means to darken. So in the second line, Hikdir Pnei Rav, that means to darken, meaning that Cain's face darkened. Darkened is a sign of his displeasure and not having his gift accepted. Exactly whether a koder is a potter because he makes a kedera, or whether it's koder because he uses clay, which is dark, I'm not sure. Again, this, as I said, we should already anticipate that there are going on frequent occasion to be words that we can estimate their meaning, but not really get them exactly. But in any event, he raised up Hevel, Biritzoto Shai Erech Nichocho, by accepting his gift. And on the other hand, the face of Rav, of Cain, was darkened, V'gam Charalo, and as a result he became angry, Ki ma'as b'shai yeter ma'achalo, because God rejected his gift of fruits. Vayif'al ze k'mishpat horehu, ki lo natzar mitzvat mitzavehu. And Cain's subsequent actions were hereditary, in the sense that just as his parents were disobedient and did something that displeased God, now Cain is about to do something that displeases God, namely v'taraf af, he became enraged, v'shamar evra, and he exercised this passion, v'chibel me'eretz ach u'mishpachotav, and he eliminated his brother and his brother's families. What does it mean, his brother's families? We have no indication that Hevel was even married, let alone that he had already had children. Okay? So this is a curious thing. There's a famous Mishnah in Sanhedrin that I'm sure that you're acquainted with one line of the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah that incorporates the line that says that whoever destroys a single life, it is as though he destroyed the entire universe. And whoever saves even a single life, it is as though he saved the entire universe. That same Mishnah quotes the pasuk we read last Shabbat, in which God says to Cain, when Cain says, "Hashomer achi anochi," God's answer to him is, "Kol demei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama." The voice of the bloods, plural, of your brother, cry out to me, tzoakim, in the plural, min ha'adama. But he only killed one person. So why is blood in the plural and why is tzoakim in the plural? So the Mishnah points out that an act of murder takes not a single life, but an act of murder also eliminates prospective lives. The Mishnah's language is damo v'dam zar'iyotav ad sof ha'olam, meaning not only was Hevel killed, but all the people who might have descended from Hevel were eliminated. So hence, in recognition of that, the Paitan here speaks about ach u'mishpachotav in the plural, as I said, with having that value reflected in the Mishnah in his mind. Vitzriach ze'aka, and as a result he cried out, ze'aka dam hashafok, the blood that was spilled cried out, right? V'ne'enash, and Cain was punished, b'navanad, right, by being forced to wander. Rosh l'shofechei dam, the Guinness record, right, the first murderer ever. V'nitvada al pesha, however, he confessed to his sin. V'nitan lo ot, and God gave him some sort of a sign. Pen yishafech damo ba'adam, at least that he would not be avenged by any other human agent. V'echel tshuva leva'e olam. And now we see again another one of the theological purposes. Why are you telling me in such detail, retelling this whole story of Cain and Hevel? Because the point is that this Piyut was intended to be recited on Yom HaKippurim, on a day in which we approach God and we say, God, we repent, right? And we'd like you to forgive us. Therefore, he's retelling this story in such detail because of the punchline. And the punchline is Vehechel Tshuva, that Cain was not only the first murderer, he was also the first penitent. And he introduced mankind to the concept of tshuva. Ki chol modeh ve'ozev, because anyone who confesses to a crime that he committed, b'tshuva and v'ozeh b'tshuva, and he commits himself to not being a recidivist, to not repeating it, Yerucham will experience God's compassion. So indeed, that is the focal point of this passage in the Piyut. So in essence, as I said, this is pretty much the genesis of Piyut in both senses of the word. In the sense of these are, at least the Yossi ben Yossi is amongst the very earliest Piyutim that we are acquainted with. And Genesis also in the sense that these are poetic reflections on the earliest chapters in the book of Genesis in Sefer Breshit. Now, again, just to complete the cycle, here is, you'd think that if Yossi ben Yossi wrote an extensive Piyut to be incorporated in the Seder Avodah, entitled Azkir Gvurot, that he would then move on to the next holiday. But not so. Another standard feature of Piyut is that Paitanim often wrote duplicate Piyutim, meaning that they would write more than one Piyut for the same liturgical purpose. So even though Yossi ben Yossi already had a Piyut for the Avodah called Azkir Gvurot, he wrote another Piyut for the Avodah called Ata Konanta Olam Berav Chesed. And here again, not going to read the whole thing through, but you can see the highlighted sections of it. Again, instead of Ikar V'ro'etzon, Oved V'ro'eh. Okay? And instead of using the terms Rav and Sa'ir, he used Rav and Rach. And instead of Shafach Dam, he uses Shalach Yad B'Tselem. Right? That is say that he struck something that was made in the image of God. Okay, and here again, just to show that it wasn't limited to the 6th century, here we have one of the later Paitanim, one of the most prolific Paitanim, Spain in the 11th century, Yitzchak ibn Giyat, in a piyut that is entitled El Esa Dei. I will lift my thoughts up to God. Same thing again, Rav and Sa'ir as opposed to Rav and Rach, and terms that we saw before in the first piyut that we looked at, Taraf v'Shichet. And indeed, these are deliberate word choices because they are meant to invoke this pasuk in the book of Amos. Now, it's true that here Amos is talking about the sins of Edom, okay? And he says, what are the sins of Edom for which there is no repentance? Arba'a lo ashivenu, al rodofo b'cherev achiv, that Esav, that the character of Esav, pursued his brother Yaakov, okay, v'shichet rachamav vayitrof la'ad apo ve'evrato shmara netzach. He tells us that Esav, Edom's enmity towards Yaakov Yisrael is eternal. You remember that the Talmud tells us that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was fond of saying, halacha, Esav sonei li Yaakov. That doesn't mean that halachic observing Gentiles are supposed to be anti-Semites. He meant halacha not in the sense of a law, he meant halacha in the sense of that's the way it is. Okay, halacha, Esav sonei liYaakov. That indeed that there is this eternal enmity. So what the Paitan here is really doing is he's saying that the attitude that Cain took towards Hevel is reflected later in the attitude that Esav took towards Yaakov. And if you jump, right, take a big historical leap, it continues to be reflected in the attitudes that the nation of Edom, who, at least according to rabbinic typology, are the Christians, still hold towards the Jewish people. Okay. I know that this week's parasha is Noach, but you'll have to bear with me at least initially as we try to compensate for the fact that we couldn't have a class last Tuesday because it was Shmini Atzeret. So next Tuesday, Amir Hashem, again, we'll start off with a little bit of just some more descriptive details about different kinds of piyutim, and then we'll quickly look at one piyut that relates to the Sidra of Noach, and then we will move along quickly to Lech Lecha, so that by the following week, by the week of Vayera, we will be up to the cycle of Torah reading. Okay, let me take a quick look at the chat. And yes, Socrates was right about the dawn side of writing. Eliezer HaKalir. Yes, again, academics seem to prefer vocalization of Kilir or Kiliri, as though it were a place name, or perhaps it were a family name. Yeah, and as I said, there's no unanimity on exactly what his name was, and equally no unanimity in terms of where and when he lived. Jews invented rhyme and poetry. Ye rhymes with you get the rhymes and sorry, and missing something. The rhymes get more complex. I don't know about, I have no idea whether Jews invented rhyme. I really don't know. No answer to that. Don't know. I can look it up. I'll ask ChatGPT. Let you know next week. And with that, thank you all again so very much. Take care.
תודה רבה.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Actually, who's the academic who's, let's call it Perush you're using on the bottom here?
Let's see if you can.
Shulamit Ali, okay.
Yeah, Shulamit Elitzur, one of the leading contemporary authorities on Piyut, was kind enough to actually anticipate me and to actually publish a book where she finds selections from Piyutim that are appropriate for every week's parasha. So more or less we will, follow her lead.
What are the dates of Yossi
I have the
ben
book here
Yossi?
to show you, and I'm glad you reminded me.
What are the dates of Yossi ben Yossi, and where did he live?
In the land of Israel, we're not sure. The latest in the 6th century, perhaps even earlier.
Interesting.
Again, mind you, we're talking about an era which is singularly poor in historical resources, right? Meaning the Roman Byzantine era, from the destruction of the first temple, past the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and up to the Arab conquest in the 7th century. That's a particularly dark age.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question? I remember a number of years ago, I read a very difficult for me book about the Piyut and the halachic problem of adding.
I appreciate that you're trying to say something that I'm interested in, but I can't quite hear you. If you'd be so good as to write it out, send it to me as an email.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Moshe Sokolow at AOL.
Okay, well, okay, thank you.
All right? That'd be much better. Then I'll be able to know exactly what you're asking and to respond to it.
Is it all one word? Or?
One word, just one word. Don't need the capitals either.
Okay, thank you.
All right? Thank you again. Bye-bye.